Okay, hi, my name is Tony Polk. I'm the founder of the Senior Advocates Network, and I'm here with Bob DeMarco. Bob is the publisher of Alzheimer's Reading Room, which is the preeminent blog on the web on Alzheimer's. Bob, thanks for coming in today.
Hey, Tony, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm good.
It's good to see you as always.
I wanted to bring Bob on because he's a really important thinker in the blogosphere about Alzheimer's. And he developed, he's been at this, by the way, about 10 years. And he developed a concept that I think is central to caring for people with Alzheimer's. Bob, before you talk about what you call the Alzheimer's world, tell me how you got into writing about the Alzheimer's.
Well, Tony, you know part of the story. I started to put up a few articles just in general to keep track of myself. And as it turned out, people started to find them. But they were more informational type pieces that were helping me. And then people started to call me, including you, and ask me questions. And as you know, you were the catalyst when you started to say to me day after day that I should write about what we were talking about. And we were talking specifically about my mother, what was going on, how I was taking care of her. It took a little while, but I finally listened to you. And that was all the way back in July 2009. That is when I started to write seriously. And I started to write quite a bit about my mother, what I was doing with her, what her behavior was like. And then after that, I started to make some podcasts and videos over time. So really, there were people that were hearing about me and they were contacting me. Most of the situations were a little different than yours. They were hearing that I was having good success with my mother from doctors and neurologists, and they were contacting me to ask me what I was doing and why I was doing what I was doing. So that was the very beginning. So the real beginning is July 2009.
So let me interrupt you for a second and tell the listeners this. Bob was unique because not only was he providing care for his mother, but he was documenting it every step of the way. So when he had trouble getting his mom to eat, he would try all these different things, and eventually he found a way to get her to eat. And that's all in his blog. By the way, I do urge you to subscribe to his blog. But first, let's talk about, so the turning point for you was when you discovered the Alzheimer's world, living in the Alzheimer's world. Can you tell the audience what we're talking about here?
Yeah. As a bit of background, the first 18 months of caring for my mother can only be described by two words: burden and heartbreak. I was trying to be kind to her, take very good care of her in a traditional sense, and it just seemed that everything I was doing was backfiring on me, and things were actually getting worse. And the biggest part of the worst was my mother was saying to me over and over, "Get out, I don't need you here, I can take care of myself." So I was just trying as hard as I could to figure out what I could do. And it happened on May 7th, 2005 at 1 o'clock in the morning. I was writing on this, I call them Da Vinci pads, this big pad. And all of a sudden I wrote on there, "Something has to change." And I started writing a circle around it. I felt all this stress coming out of my shoulders. And I remember clearly thinking this, wow, I didn't think I had that much stress. And I sat there for maybe a half a minute or a minute, and then I wrote underneath that, "And that something is me." And I started to write circles around that, and I connected them by a line, and I had this big smile on my face because I knew I was onto something. My smile was so hard that my jaw started to hurt, but I didn't know exactly what it meant. But I did realize that even though I thought I had changed and I was being a good caregiver and doing all the kind of things that I thought made a good caregiver, it wasn't the case. So the next day I woke up, and the minute I woke up, all day long in my brain, I'm going, something has to change, something has to change. The next day I invented what was originally called Dottie's World, and here was the construct. I had known my mother all my life. So I was trying to deal with her in the way I would having known her as she was before the onset of Alzheimer's. So I would try to explain to her and try to reason with her, and everything I did backfired on me. So I decided I had to go to a new place and basically create that place little by little, because it was going to be impossible for me to stay where I was in what I came to call real world, because I just kept falling back on all the things I was used to doing with my mother and saying with my mother. So then I went to Dottie's world, and after about 2 weeks, I called it Alzheimer's world for the first time. And basically what I would do when my mother would start doing something, let's just call it a little nutty, I would get up, and the first thing I would do is take one great big giant step to the left, and in my brain I would say to myself, Alzheimer's world, as if I was flipping a switch in my brain to get into this other place. That's part of your question. I can keep going if you want.
I want you to keep going. Give me a kind of a when you say you stepped off into Alzheimer's world, how did your behavior change towards your mother?
Well, I was going to invent this new place. And my first step to the left, I went into Alzheimer's world. So, for example, my mother had this habit of opening up the freezer and unpacking things, unwrapping them, and just looking at them and throwing them back into the freezer. And we have this freezer and refrigerator that beeps if the door's ajar or it's open too long. And this thing would go and beep, beep, beep. Before I made it to the world, that was driving me crazy. Imagine hearing that thing beep 27 times. Beep, beep, beep. Beep, beep, beep. Your normal reaction is to go in there and close the refrigerator or freezer door, and that's what your brain is telling you to do. So when I was in that situation with my mother, I would get up there to the freezer or refrigerator, and I'd say, let me help you, so I could get whatever it is she wanted and close the door. When I walked into Alzheimer's world, the very first time this happened, and we have two entrances to our kitchen, I went to the far entrance where my mother really couldn't see me, and I started leaning up against the world, and just automatically, what I was doing was I started, instead of jumping in on her and making her upset, I just stood there and started to think, what is she doing, and why is she doing it? And then pretty much I started to understand, and as this kind of went on cumulatively with her, medication, showers, eating, all the simple problems really, although they're not simple to solve unless you know the way to do it, these became normal to me in Alzheimer's world. So all of the things that my mother was doing in the real world with me were driving me crazy, making me feel disconcerted, sometimes angry and sometimes mean. But in Alzheimer's world, they all of a sudden, those are normal behaviors in Alzheimer's world, all the kind of little crazy things that Alzheimer's patients do. So that was the first part of the process. So in each and every situation, I started to ask myself why, how, when, what time of day, when's this happening? And over time, I started to see patterns of behavior that are, for lack of a better word, indigenous to Alzheimer's patients. Because a typical patient is like other typical patients, not that you can put them all into one, box. And as time went on, I started to realize my mother was doing the same kinds of things the same time of day. So that meant she had a pattern, and I started to see the pattern. I started to learn that the nicer I was, the more I explained to her, like, why she had to do this and why she had to do that. Try to just explain to her why she had to take her medication. It wasn't working. It was confusing her, because she, after 10 words, really didn't know what I was talking about. She couldn't follow along that many words. So these are the kinds of things that started to happen in Alzheimer's world. And what I was doing was putting in a ground floor, which I later on started to call understanding, and then putting in some more floors, which I started to call coping. As the caregiver, you have to learn how to cope with these behaviors, but if you can't understand them, you can't cope with them. And then as time was going on, I started to layer on the really big floors, and I call those communication, how to communicate with a person. And you cannot communicate with a person living with Alzheimer's, Tony, the same way you do in the real world. It doesn't work. And the reason why it doesn't work, the simple basic reason is the short-term memory continues to worsen until it's totally shot. In other words, it's gone. So my mother could be sitting at the table, had just finished eating, hold a little conversation with me. It's a good example of how the short-term memory is gone. And then look at me and say, are we ever going to eat today? With her plate right in front of her. So this.
So what did you do? What did you do? What did you learn to do in Alzheimer's world?
Well, this was teaching me all these different things. I refer to it as 3 little words. When patients are normally diagnosed, they're asked to remember 3 words or 3 objects, and then they're asked to draw a clock, and then they're asked to repeat the 3 words. Well, they can't remember the 3 words. So if I'm going to start saying to my mom in the situation, Mom, you just ate. Don't you remember we just ate? Look at your plate. It's right in front of you. We already ate, and we ate lunch, and we ate breakfast too, blah, 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 blah. It won't work because she doesn't obviously remember she just ate, or she wouldn't have asked me when we're going to eat. Well, if she doesn't remember right now, she certainly doesn't remember lunch and breakfast and all the snacks in between. And you get to a point when you're starting to think about who, why, what, when, and all that stuff, you start to find it easier to embrace the reality of the Alzheimer's patient. So you start to understand that they're not being crazy or mean when they say, when are we going to eat? And they just finished eating, or they start asking you the same questions over and over. This is a function of the Alzheimer's brain. And here's the point. In Alzheimer's world, these behaviors are normal, and you actually come to expect them. And in that process, you learn how to accept them, and then you learn how to deal with them. So if my mother said to me, we just ate, I would say, or, when are we going to eat? And I would probably just say, every situation is different. I would probably say, we're going to eat in a little while. And then I would just continue on in my conversation with her. And then at some point she would forget. I'd pick up the plate, and that's when I'd say, come on, we're going to wash the dishes. And I'd take her over. Here's a little, I'll just interject this. We stopped using our dishwasher. Every time we ate, me and my mother did the dishes. I washed, she dried, she put them in the little thing. Sometimes she would get back to them and try to put them away before I did. And of course, she'd put them all, the glasses where the dishes go. And that will drive you crazy before you make it to Alzheimer's world. After it started happening later on, I would actually laugh that the plates were with the dishes and this and that and the other thing. So, and the point I was going to make, Tony, my mother's been gone for 4 years. I still don't use a dishwasher. I do the dishes. Normally, sometimes they stack up a little, but I try to do them as I go because, and here's the key, that became my pattern of behavior along with my mother's pattern of behavior, and I just never changed that pattern back. So in a sense, I kept that pattern with me and brought it over into the real world.
So Bobby, I want everybody to know that we're going to do more of these talks, and Bob is a fountain of information, but I want to get to 2 basic points. One is, how did your feeling about taking care of your mother change? That's the first question. Go ahead. I'll let you answer that first.
Well, it's a difficult question for me to answer in this respect. When my mother was clearly sick and I didn't know what it was, I had made my mind up 20 or 30 years before that. When the time came, I was going to take care of my mom. So when the time came, I didn't expect it to be Alzheimer's, but I knew I was going to take care of her. So unlike many caregivers, my mind was made up. No matter what it was, I was going to take care of my mom. A more specific answer to your question is that as I stopped beating up my mom by trying to constantly explain to her why, if she didn't take her medication, she was going to get sick, or if she didn't take a shower, she might get sick, or she would stink, or whatever you say. Once I stopped doing that, here's the answer to your question. We started to get along closer to the way that we had before Alzheimer's. So if you're asking me what changed, certainly making it to Alzheimer's world changed my view of what was going on around me, and it changed both my mother's behavior and my behavior and the way we viewed each other and the way that we interacted with each other. So that's what was changing.
The short answer is you got along better and you both were happier. Is that right?
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. And I'll just interject this. It's an amazing process because as she became easier to deal with, I became happier. As I became happier, she became happier. But a lot of what was going on was just a cumulative effect feeding on itself. It was improving all the time. But I want to interject. That didn't save her memory. That just allowed us to interact interpersonally more effective with each other. And ultimately, as a part of Alzheimer's world, one of the first decisions, I know you want to cut it off here, that I wrote on my pad is, we will begin living our life. And what I meant by that was, I realized up in those first 18 months, we were living in a cave. We weren't doing much of anything. And that's no good for anybody. We weren't getting much socialization. We weren't getting any exercise. We weren't going out into the light that much. We were doing every wrong thing you could possibly do for your health, both mental and physically. So I decided, because I could see that my mother could do more than I thought, that one by one we would start to build a routine. So that's where we were going after we started to get some understanding of each other. And I started to get a real understanding about how the brain was functioning in my mother and accepted it in Alzheimer's world.
So final question is, do you come across a good deal of people, you know, a fair amount of people who just haven't made this leap yet?
It's rare to run across the person that's made this specific leap on their own. I can tell you I've had thousands of people email me that have taken a giant step to the left after reading about it or hearing me speak. And they're always amazed at the immediate transition of their brain when they go in this place called Alzheimer's world, and everything seems more normal to them. They feel less stressed out, and they don't get all that anxiety and anger build up over something that, quite frankly, with an Alzheimer's patient, Tony, is going to happen every day, day after day.
Well, you know, just to the audience, every time I talk to Bob, I learn something, not first about Alzheimer's, but also it's a very impressive to run. He's a grown man. He's a little younger than me, but not much. And, you know, the dedication he showed to his mother was extraordinary, and I honor him for it. So listen, I'm going to cut it off here. I would like to say that you do yourself a favor to go to alzheimersreadingroom.com and subscribe to his newsletter. He has 30,000 people on his newsletter. It's a good newsletter. The people who are running the programs at Harvard call him and ask him how to do stuff. So this is a serious dude. And last but not least, if you could look down after we get off this call, there's a subscribe button to my newsletter, and I appreciate you subscribing to that. Anyway, and you get to see more Bob. Thanks so much. I appreciate it, and we'll say goodbye. Thanks, Bob.
Great, as always, Tony. Thank you.
Bye-bye.